Last bus to nowhere. Noah Carter pulled his coat tighter around his body as he trudged along the empty highway. His car had died nearly 3 miles back, refusing to start no matter how many times he turned the key in the ignition. The battery, the engine, he had no idea what had gone wrong. He wasn't a mechanic. All he knew was that the road stretched on in both directions, endless and dark, with no signs of life except for the occasional rustle of trees in the cold autumn wind. Then, like an answer to a silent prayer, he spotted the glow of neon in the distance. A bus station. It looked abandoned even from afar, the flickering sign barely clinging to life. Grey Ridge Bus Terminal. The letters buzzed softly in the night air, some of them failing to fully illuminate. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few rusted cars that looked like they hadn't moved in years. A lone street light stood at the edge of the lot, its beam too weak to do much against the creeping darkness. Noah hesitated. Something about the place felt wrong. The air here was heavier, colder, as if the wind carried whispers instead of leaves. But what choice did he have? There were no other buildings nearby, and his phone had died hours ago. If there was even a chance he could catch a bus, it was worth checking out. He stepped inside. The inside of the terminal was just as eerie as the outside. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, casting long, jittery shadows across the cracked tile floor. The waiting area consisted of rows of plastic chairs, most of them empty, though a single old man sat slumped forward, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a tattered baseball cap. A digital schedule board hung above the main counter, its screen filled with garbled text and static. Noah squinted at it, trying to make out any real information, but the letters kept glitching, shifting from names of cities to symbols that made no sense. Behind the counter, a woman appeared. Noah hadn't seen her there a moment ago. She was just suddenly present, as if she had always been there, waiting for him to notice. She wore a faded uniform that looked several decades out of style, muted blue fabric with a stiff collar, and a small name tag that he couldn't read from this distance. Her hair was neatly pulled back, and her skin was pale, almost too pale under the flickering lights. "Last bus leaves in 10 minutes, she said. Her voice was flat, emotionless, yet strangely melodic. Noah swallowed. He hadn't even asked about a bus yet. "Where's it going?" he asked. The woman's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Home?" A chill ran down Noah's spine. For a moment, Noah hesitated. The woman's answer had been too vague, too simple. Home. The word lingered in his mind, stirring something uneasy in his gut. He wanted to ask what exactly she meant. Home, as in his home. Some random town in the middle of nowhere. But the way she looked at him, her pale face serene, her hands folded neatly on the counter, made him second-guess whether he should even question it. Behind her, an old analog clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the station. Tick, tick, tick. The second hand jerked forward in sharp, unnatural movements, like something struggling to function properly. Noah shifted his weight from foot to foot. The place was unsettling, but standing here wasn't going to get him anywhere. "All right," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "How much for a ticket?" The woman tilted her head slightly, her smile never wavering. "There's no charge," Noah blinked. "Excuse me?" "You don't need to pay," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "All passengers ride for free." He frowned. Nothing in life was free. Even the most run-down bus stations charged something for a ticket. His instincts told him to turn around, walk back into the night, and take his chances on the road. But then he remembered his dead phone, the empty highway, the miles of darkness stretching in both directions. If this was his only way out, did he really have a choice? Still, something gnawed at him. "Who operates this route?" he asked. The woman's smile widened just a fraction. The bus will be here soon. Noah exhaled slowly, deciding to drop the subject. Arguing wasn't going to do him any good. He turned away from the counter and walked toward the waiting area, glancing at the old man still sitting on the bench. The man hadn't moved an inch since Noah arrived. His arms remained crossed, his chin dipped slightly, the shadow of his cap obscuring most of his face. "Hey," Noah said, half expecting no response. The old man twitched slightly, his fingers tightening around his arms, but he didn't lift his head. "Where's this bus going?" Noah asked. A long pause. Then, in a voice so hoarse it barely sounded human, the man muttered, "Nowhere good." Noah's chest tightened. He opened his mouth to ask more, but before he could, a distant sound cut through the silence, a low, mechanical rumble, growing louder by the second. The bus was coming. The headlights appeared first, two pale beams cutting through the darkness outside. The sound of grinding metal filled the air, the groan of an engine too old to be running this late. Noah turned toward the glass doors at the entrance, watching as the massive vehicle rolled into view. It was old, much older than any bus he'd ever seen. The exterior was covered in grime, the paint chipped away in places to reveal rusted metal beneath. The windows were tinted so dark he couldn't see inside. But what unsettled him the most was the destination sign above the windshield. It was blank. No city name, no route number. Just empty, flickering light. The bus came to a slow, laborious stop in front of the station. Steam hissed from its undercarriage, curling into the cold night air like ghostly fingers. The doors groaned open with an agonizing creak, revealing a darkened interior. The station fell deathly silent. Even the flickering lights above seemed to dim, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Then, from the shadowy doorway of the bus, a figure emerged. The driver. He stepped down onto the pavement, his boots thudding against the cracked concrete. His uniform was black, the fabric strangely stiff, as if it had never been washed. A cap sat low over his forehead, obscuring his eyes, and his skin, what little of it was visible, was disturbingly gray, almost ashen under the dim station lights. Noah felt an immediate and overwhelming instinct to back away. The driver stood still for a moment, his posture unnervingly rigid. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he turned his head toward Noah. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Then, in a voice that sounded more like a breath of wind than a human sound, the driver spoke. "All aboard." Noah hesitated. The driver stood there, unmoving, waiting. His presence was deeply unsettling. There was something off about the way he held himself, too still, too rigid, like a mannequin pretending to be human. Behind him, the open door of the bus gaped like a black hole, swallowing what little light reached inside. Noah couldn't see any passengers, couldn't hear any rustling of movement or idle conversation. Just silence. He glanced back toward the station counter, hoping for some reassurance from the woman. But she was gone. His stomach dropped. The old man on the bench let out a low chuckle, dry and humorless. "I'd turn back if I were you," he muttered, his voice rough with age. Noah swallowed hard. His gut screamed at him to listen, to step away, to turn and run into the night, no matter how far he'd have to walk. But then he thought about the highway, the cold, the endless miles of darkness. He had no car, no phone, no way to call for help. This was his only way out. Noah took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward. The driver didn't move, didn't speak again. He only tilted his head slightly, as if observing something curious. As Noah climbed the metal steps, the scent of old, stale air filled his lungs, a mix of rust, dust, and something faintly metallic, like dried blood. The moment his foot touched the floor of the bus, the doors let out a shuddering hiss and slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed through the empty interior. Only It wasn't empty anymore. Noah froze. Passengers now filled the seats, sitting stiffly in the dim light. He could have sworn the bus had been deserted a second ago, but now, figures lined both sides of the aisle, heads facing forward, hands resting unnaturally still on their laps. Their clothes were outdated, as if they'd stepped out of different decades. Old wool coats, faded dresses, tattered suits. Some had hats pulled low over their faces. Others had scarves wrapped around their necks, concealing everything but their vacant, unmoving eyes. No one spoke. No one even acknowledged his presence. The only open seat was near the middle of the bus. The driver, now back in his seat, adjusted his cap and gripped the massive wheel with gloved hands. The bus gave a low, mechanical groan, the gears grinding in protest as it lurched forward. Noah stumbled slightly but caught himself on the nearest seat. He let out a shaky breath and walked down the aisle. Every step felt heavier, as if the air inside the bus carried a weight of its own. His gaze flickered from passenger to passenger, searching for any sign of life. A twitch of a finger, a shift in posture. Anything. Nothing. They just sat there, still as statues. With a dry throat, Noah slid into the empty seat. Outside, the landscape passed by in a blur. But something was wrong. The bus wasn't heading toward town. There were no familiar road signs, no street lights, no intersections, just endless darkness. A thick fog curled outside the windows, swallowing everything beyond the immediate glow of the headlights. It was as if the world itself had dissolved into nothingness. Noah's pulse quickened. He turned to the passenger beside him, a woman in a long coat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Hey," he whispered, "do you know where this bus is going?" She didn't react. Her head remained perfectly still, her face half hidden beneath the shadow of her hat. Something was wrong with her skin. It was too pale, almost translucent, like wax, like she wasn't real. Noah's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he reached out, just enough to brush the edge of her sleeve. Her head snapped toward him. Noah jerked back, his heart slamming against his ribs. The woman's face was wrong. Her eyes were too wide, too hollow, her lips parted slightly as if frozen mid-gasp. But there was no breath, no movement in her chest. She wasn't alive, and neither was anyone else on this bus. A low, wheezing chuckle drifted through the cabin. Noah turned sharply. The old man from the station was now sitting a few rows behind him. He hadn't been there when Noah boarded. "Should have listened," the man rasped. Noah's skin prickled. The bus kept moving. The fog outside thickened, and deep in his bones, he knew this ride had no end, and no way back. Last bus to nowhere. Noah's breathing grew shallow. His fingers dug into the cracked leather of his seat as he turned back toward the window, hoping, praying, that maybe he was just seeing things. Maybe it was exhaustion, the cold, the stress of the night playing tricks on his mind. But the fog outside had thickened, pressing against the glass like something alive, swirling in sluggish, deliberate movements. The landscape beyond was gone. No roads, no trees, no towns, just an abyss of shifting gray. A sudden noise made him jump, a wet, rattling gasp. It came from the woman beside him. Noah's heart slammed against his ribs. He turned slowly, his muscles rigid with dread. Her mouth had fallen open, her lips cracking as they stretched unnaturally wide. A sound, like a drowning person struggling for air, escaped her throat. But her chest didn't rise or fall. Then, in a jerking, puppet-like motion, she twisted toward him. Noah recoiled. Her eyes, they were gone. Dark, hollow sockets gaped where they should have been, the edges cracked like old porcelain. Something writhed inside them, shadows that pulsed and slithered, shifting as if they were watching him without needing eyes at all. A shudder ran through the entire bus. The The lights overhead flickered violently. Then, all at once, every single passenger turned to face Noah. Their heads snapped in eerie synchronization, their bodies remaining stiff, their mouths slack. Some had missing eyes, like the woman beside him. Others had sunken, skeletal faces, their skin stretched thin over their bones, their lips curled back in grotesque grins. A wave of nausea rolled through Noah's stomach. The air changed, the musty scent of old metal now tainted with something rotten, something foul, a thick, cloying stench like decay. Noah gripped the edge of his seat. What the hell is this? The old man let out another low, wheezing chuckle. You should have never gotten on, he rasped. Noah turned sharply toward him, his pulse a hammering drum in his ears. What is this place? Where is this bus going? The old man tilted his head, his milky, cataract-filled eyes gleaming in the dim light. It doesn't go anywhere, son. The bus lurched violently. Noah nearly fell forward as the entire vehicle shuddered, the metal groaning like something immense was pressing against it from the outside. He whipped his head toward the window. The fog was no longer just fog. Shapes moved within it. Tall, spindly figures with elongated limbs and gaping mouths, their forms flickering like broken film reels. They were running alongside the bus. No, not running. Reaching. Long, clawed fingers dragged against the windows, leaving behind streaks of black, oily residue. Some of them slammed their faces against the glass, faces that weren't human at all, but shifting, contorted voids of writhing mouths and empty sockets. Noah's stomach twisted into knots. The bus driver hadn't reacted to any of it. He sat rigidly at the wheel, his cap still obscuring most of his face. But his hands, his fingers were wrong. Too long, too many joints. The way they flexed and twitched against the wheel was inhuman. Noah's throat went dry. He forced himself to move, gripping the seat in front of him as he pushed himself up. I need to get off this bus, he said, his voice barely steady. The old man didn't laugh this time. His expression grew solemn. There ain't no getting off once you're on. The bus groaned, the windows rattling violently as if something enormous had slammed against the side. Noah turned toward the doors, and his blood turned to ice. The aisle was no longer empty. A figure stood between him and the exit. Tall, gaunt, wrapped in tattered black fabric that moved like smoke, like it wasn't entirely part of this reality. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was obscured beneath a hood of shifting darkness. But Noah could feel its gaze boring into him, dissecting him. And then, it took a step forward. The bus lights flickered. The other passengers didn't move, didn't react. Noah's breath came in short, ragged gasps. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. The figure reached out. A skeletal hand, the fingers elongated and tapering into sharp, ink-black claws, stretched toward him. The bus jerked again, this time harder, more violently. The lights exploded, showering the aisle in a rain of shattered glass. And then, the bus plunged into complete darkness. A deafening howl erupted around him, a chorus of voices screaming, wailing, whispering in languages Noah had never heard. He clenched his eyes shut. For a single, terrifying second, he felt himself falling. Noah's body tensed as the darkness swallowed him whole. For a brief, terrifying moment, he felt weightless, like he was suspended in a void, disconnected from time and reality itself. The howling whispers surrounded him, pressing against his skull, their voices a mixture of languages he couldn't understand and fragments of his own thoughts, twisted and distorted. Then, light, not bright, not warm, just a dull, flickering glow like the last dying embers of a fire. Noah gasped, his vision swimming as the world snapped back into focus. He was still on the bus, but something was different. The seats were empty now. The passengers gone. The cracked leather, once faded and torn, now looked fresh, new but wrong. The material pulsed slightly, like something was moving beneath the surface. The air had changed too, no longer cold and musty, but thick, heavy, humid, carrying a faint metallic tang. His stomach turned. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window. The fog outside had thinned, and for the first time since the bus had started moving, he could see where they were. His pulse stuttered. It wasn't a road. It wasn't anywhere he recognized. The ground outside was black, not asphalt, not dirt, just a smooth, endless void stretching in all directions. Towering structures loomed in the distance, their forms shifting, breathing, as if they weren't built, but grown. Some twisted unnaturally, their spires curling like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. And the sky, Noah's breath hitched. There was no sky, just an abyss of swirling red and black, like a wound cut into the fabric of reality, pulsing with something alive. The bus gave a low, shuddering groan, like a dying animal, its frame trembling. And then, a voice. End of the line. Noah turned his head slowly. The driver was standing right beside him. No sound, no movement, just there, suddenly, impossibly close. Noah's body locked up. The driver's face was still obscured by his cap, but now Noah could see more clearly. His skin wasn't skin. It was stretched too tightly, like old brittle leather. And beneath the brim of the cap, where his eyes should have been, nothing. Only two hollow, endless voids, deeper than the darkness outside. Something moved inside them, something that saw him. The driver extended a hand, long, gnarled fingers wrapped in cracked black gloves. "This is where you get off," he said, voice smooth and final. Noah's entire body screamed in protest. Number. No, this wasn't right. This wasn't real. He had to wake up, had to move, had to fight. But his body was already rising from the seat, not by choice. His legs moved on their own, carrying him down the aisle as if pulled by invisible strings. His hands trembled, his breaths shallow, each step heavier than the last. The door hissed open. Beyond it, nothing but that endless, pulsing black ground. He tried to resist, to grab onto something, anything. But the moment his foot touched the ground outside, the bus doors slammed shut behind him. A deafening roar erupted in his ears. The world collapsed. Noah opened his eyes. The station. He was sitting in one of the plastic chairs. The old flickering lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting weak illumination over the cracked tile floor. The air was still. Had he dreamed it? Number. He could feel it. Something was wrong. Slowly, he turned his head. The counter was empty. The schedule board above it, completely blank. No destinations, no times. And then, a low rumble. Outside, headlights cut through the night. A bus was arriving. But this time, Noah wasn't waiting for it. He was already here. And deep in his bones, he understood. He had never left, and he never would. The end.